beautiful beings. Before we get started with today's story, I just wanted to say thank you for the overwhelming support and love you guys have shown me, and thank you for joining me on my journey. Also, I want to thank today's video sponsor, Tubby Energy. Today's video is brought to you by Tubby Energy, the ultimate energy drink designed for gamers, creators, and anyone who needs a boost without the crash. Unlike those other energy drinks loaded with sugar and junk, Tubby is packed with clean ingredients to fuel your focus, energy, and performance all day long. Whether you're grinding through a gaming session or just need that extra push to get through your day, Tubby's got you covered. And the best part, it's jitter-free. No weird crashes, just clean, sustained energy. Check out the link in the description below and use my code WETT at checkout to save 20% off your order. Yes, that's right. Not 10, but a whopping 20% off. Power up with Tubby Energy and stay on top of your game. A huge thank you to Tubby for sponsoring this video. Alright, let's dive into today's video. Hi, I'm a 32-year-old woman and a phlebotomist at a rural hospital. In case you're unfamiliar with phlebotomy, I'm someone who takes blood from patients and prepares it for various kinds of testing. Last year, I encountered an issue with a patient that I've never seen before or since. It's been hard to get off my mind, and I hope writing about it will help. I guess this is also a last-ditch effort in hoping that someone will believe me and help me understand what happened. I've worked at this hospital for 4 years, after spending the previous 4 at a nursing home. I had a bit of a rough upbringing, mixed with some drug use. Actually part of what got me into this line of work. As I mentioned, my current hospital is deeply rural. There are about 15 miles of woods right out back. I used to spend my smoke breaks out there before all of this. I encountered this patient on the graveyard shift, also known as the overnight. I'm rarely booked on those, as phlebotomy is considered the less urgent sector of the hospital that usually doesn't require late nights, but we were lighter than usual on nurses back then. I was just sitting down when the CNO told me that we needed a drawer in A145. I remember feeling annoyed as I made my way towards the back of the hospital. Whoever had done their intake had put this patient at the very end of the hall, with about 20 empty rooms between them and our other bookings that night. It was off the round structure. A 145 was the only room with light under the door. I did my usual knock and announcement before walking in. This part was all captured in the hallway monitor, which I checked the next day. The moment I walked in, I nearly fell backward. A man had pulled the chair from the far corner of the room, near the window, right up to the doorway. He was sitting and facing the entrance and sprung to his feet the moment I walked in. A boy was lying on the bed behind him, and I could feel a breeze coming from outside. I distinctly remember that the man had on a ball cap that read Louisville in faded letters, and big black sunglasses that contrasted his sallow, droopy skin. He was wearing a shirt that also read Louisville, and he stepped back as I stepped forward, pushing the chair behind him with a scrape. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said quickly, shaking his head back and forth. I remember just laughing in response and telling him it was fine, that I was just used to the chair being in the corner. I turned for the patient chart tucked in the clipboard holder and found it missing. When I turned back, the man was holding it out for me and told me that he'd just finished filling it out. I took it with a nod, scanning the details, then walking over to the boy. It had been filled in with sloppy handwriting. I don't remember all the specifics of how I interacted with the boy, but I know I must have followed my usual procedures before a draw. I smiled down at him, and he stared up at me with watery, green eyes. He looked 12, the age his chart read. "Hi there, Lewis," I remember remember saying, glancing for his name. I asked him how he felt today. The boy looked at the man, then back to me. I heard the scrape of the chair being pulled closer to the bed behind me. I feel fine, but my father and I want to make sure that I'm all normal. So we came to try this. At that point, the father had his hands on the foot of the bed and was leaning forward, staring from beneath the thick sunglasses. Of course, Lewis. Well, I'm going to check that out by borrowing a little blood from you if that's all right. It really won't hurt at all. That is roughly what I responded. Suddenly, the man piped up, speaking quickly and loudly so that both Lewis and I turned to him. It won't hurt at all. The boy nodded in response and seemed to repeat it to himself. I felt myself begin to grow uneasy at the father's mannerisms as I made my way across the room to the medical cabinet. This unease was compounded by a gust from the open window, which chilled me in my scrubs. As I looked out the open window, I could see the tree line not too far away, and the branches swaying and clawing against the night sky. I remember that very distinctly. We never kept the windows open, so I moved to close it. As my hand stretched out, I could see the man standing stiffly behind me in the reflection from the glass. Please, leave it open, he cooed. We get very hot. I was tired, and the man was standing very close to me, so I acquiesced, turning back to the medical cabinet and opening it for my supplies. I grabbed what I needed and placed it on the sink counter, washing my hands as I routinely did and slipping on my gloves. I know that all the equipment I took was standard: butterfly needles, vacutainer, collection, tubes, gauze, tourniquet, everything you'd expect. There was nothing faulty about the materials. I know that isn't what happened here. I walked up to the left side of the bed and asked Lewis to sit up nice and straight. Normally, I prefer using a nice cushiony chair, but those are a bit down the hall and we're already comfortable in bed, is what I told him, stupidly, instead of taking him to the drawer room. I remember things more vividly from here. I placed the collection tubes and needle down on the small table nearby and applied the tourniquet around his mid-bicep. He stared solemnly up at the ceiling as I began to thumb the crook of his arm for the vein. That's when I first knew something was wrong. As I stared down at the boy's arm and felt around with my fingers, I couldn't find the tracings of his veins anywhere. I pressed my thumb harder, squinting as if it would make the blue streaks appear beneath his skin. After nearly a minute, I started to feel confused. I smiled up at the boy, whose eyes held the same watery stare. I decided I'd best try my luck with a puncture. I drew my tools, wiping the crook of his arm with alcohol and aiming the needle in the same place I always did. I was hoping I was just tired. As I dug the needle in, I hoped for the momentary resistance and then gentle pop that accompanied the finding of a vein. But none came. I'm sorry, I'm going to need to try again, I said softly. It was what I always remark when I can't find the vein, though I rarely need to. I slid out the needle slowly, pressing a square of gauze against the area, before repuncturing. Again, I felt nothing. As this process continued for 6 failed puncture attempts, I began to notice a few things. The first, which I realised as I pushed in the needle for the 3rd time, my teeth gritted, was that the boy did not seem pained at any moment. It was like putting an IV drip in an unconscious person. The second thing I noticed, while I withdrew the needle for the 5th time, was that the gauze I was pressing against the venipuncture sites was clean. I turned the white pad back to me and didn't see a single drop of red. As I looked at his arm, I could see the holes I'd made, but no spotting of blood. The 3rd thing I noticed, after my 6th attempt was unsuccessful, was how close the man had gotten to me while I was trying to draw his son's blood. He was seated on the other side of a rather wide hospital bed, but he was stretching across it, leaning on his hands and crooning his neck, his face only a foot from mine. I almost dropped the needle when I saw him, and it unnerved me even more than Lewis's seeming lack of veins. "Something is wrong," the man breathed, and I moved my chair back to create some distance. I put down the needle and stood up, moving towards the foot of the bed. The man paralleled my movements, shooting up from his seat and standing in front of me with a few long strides. The man spoke in a hushed voice from beneath his cap and glasses. "Please, tell me what's wrong." He sounded nervous, in a genuine way, but it did nothing to reduce my unease. I whispered back, "I'm sorry, I just haven't seen this before. I'm searching for a vein to draw from, and I just can't find one." The man paused, his hands fidgeting. "What do you mean exactly?" I let out a confused laugh, mostly out of discomfort. I remember wondering if there was a language barrier. "I mean, I can't find the vein, as in the blue tubes filled with blood in his arm. I've never been unable to locate them like this. It's not normal," the man muttered, seeming to cock his head to the window behind me. "It's okay. I'll talk to him. He's just nervous." I shook my head back and forth, confused. I don't think he's nervous. In fact, most kids are a little scared of the pain, but Lewis doesn't even seem to notice it. I'm worried something is wrong with him. Maybe some kind of hypovolemia. His skin feels almost rubbery. The man began to shake his head back and forth, as if he were mimicking my motion. No, pain and veins. He's all right. I will speak with him for just a second, and then you'll check again." The man was wringing his hands together now. The skin on them, like on his face, looked too wrinkled for his age. The man spun back towards the boy and took 3 long strides until he was at his side, muttering something. I looked over to the door and pictured the long stretch of hallway between myself and the rest of the people in the hospital. I considered who had done intake for the 2 of them, and if the man would even know what I meant if I asked for his insurance. I looked back out the window and wondered again, more intensely than I had the first time, why the glass and the screen were open. The man's voice cut into my thoughts. "Okay, he is ready." The man was standing next to my chair, one hand tightly gripping the boy's shoulder. A thought came to me then, that if I were to yank that hat and sunglasses off his face, the man would fall apart like that girl with the ribbon on her neck. The idea scared me. As I moved towards my chair, the man slinked behind it, holding the back of the seat. Looking at the both of them was starting to make me sick. One time I saw a patient brought in who'd clipped his knee against a rock while cliff diving, twisting his lower leg so badly his foot was facing backward. The wrongness of looking at that was what I felt while looking at the father and his son. I sat in the chair and just focused on the boy, hearing the man breathing heavily behind me. I drew a fresh needle for Lewis and reached for him before my eyes widened. There, running up and down his arm, were thick blue veins. I gripped his elbow and could feel them pumping beneath the skin. They were undoubtedly there. I could hear the man's breath quickening, almost with excitement. I didn't know what to say. I wiped the area in the crook of the boy's arm and prepared the needle. Lewis's skin felt moist, even through my gloves. I saw his face and neck too, had droplets of perspiration. His skin was almost sticky now. "I'm scared." Lewis's voice came out like the croak of a frog. His big, watery eyes met mine. Some of his hair was clinging to his forehead from the sweat. I stopped moving the needle toward his arm and leaned forward. "Lewis, are you okay? Is something going on?" is what I responded. I could feel the man leaning over me. The boy nodded yes. "I'm scared of the pain from the needle." "It won't hurt any more than last time, Lewis. It's okay." assured him, but I myself was confused. After that, Lewis turned to look back towards the ceiling, his face going back to the stern grimace it had the entire time. I'd never seen such an inhuman reaction before. I didn't know what to do but proceed with drawing the blood. I aimed the needle right towards the bright, obvious veins and dug it into his arm. I felt the pop of the vein almost instantly. I closed my eyes for a moment as the blood flowed from the needle into the first vial on the small table. I vividly imagined 20 minutes from now, when I was back down the hall, recanting what an odd experience my last draw was, and someone would commiserate with me that the graveyard shifts were always a mental strain. That's where I wanted to be. I opened my eyes and let out a gasp that barely avoided being a scream. What I saw was that the blood sliding from the needle, up the tubes, filling the first vial, was a deep blue, the same colour as the boy's veins. It looked like thick blue paint. I likely would have fallen backward out of my seat if it didn't mean I'd fall into the man behind me, and the idea of touching him was worse than anything. What's wrong now? The man's was leaning down behind me, not far from my ear. His voice sounded harsher now than when he last asked this. Nothing, I remember stuttering out. I stopped the drawer as it filled the first vial, sliding the needle out and wrapping gauze around the puncture point that began to stain blue. I knew I needed to get out of there. I picked up the vial and could hear the man moving behind me. The boy held his same zombie-like stare at the ceiling. As I stood up, the man was in front of me, between my path to the door. One of his hands was extended out to me. He was grinning, and I looked away from his teeth. I've replayed this interaction a lot of times in my head. Please, I said then. I don't know exactly why. Everything's normal with the boy now. Yes, I sputtered out. I felt like I could hear movement from outside the window. Excited movement. Please, the man replied, grinning wider. I held out a vial, placing it into his palm, from which the skin seemed to sag, and he moved out of my way. I almost ran towards the door, pulling it open, as I felt tears begin to well in my eyes, and then slamming it behind me. My leaving, as well, was captured on the camera. And that was that. I told the CNO and whoever was there at the time, nearly hysterical, that there was something horribly wrong in the room at the end of the hall, but it was empty once they'd reached it. I don't know exactly why any of it happened. I know people in here are probably more willing than most circles of the internet to believe this kind of crazy stuff. If anyone has any ideas, I'm open to hearing them. I haven't come up with any medical or logical prognosis. The last thing I should say is that since then, if I'm ever unfortunate enough to get the graveyard shift, I'm very careful. I make sure to lock all the windows before it gets dark, because I sometimes hear the ones in the empty rooms rattling from the outside. Back in April of 2013, I went through something that I haven't been able to talk about. I was paid a significant amount of money to stay quiet in return for signing a 10-year agreement to shut the hell up. Now that the time is up, I've considered my options. I could just let this go and never speak of it again. I won't gain anything from speaking out, and I got a lot to lose. But then again, this is just an anonymous post online. Words have less meaning that way. West Virginia. It was hotter than usual, without a whiff of wind. I was coming home from a visit to my aunt. She'd broken her leg and couldn't leave her house. I was making my way back home, taking the I-64 out of Lewisburg. It started with the radio. It was playing that one Macklemore song I'd heard 100 times over. The sound was cutting in and out in a quick staccato, then disappeared completely. I could hear cars honking up front as a line began to form. There was a sway in the trees, as if greater and greater pressure was being put on them. I could hear wind rushing against the left side of the car, forcing me to pull the other way to compensate. I closed the sunroof as a dust cloud blew past, staining the windshield. Then, a rumble. It sounded like thunder, but from the ground, like a groaning bellow, growing louder and clearer by the second. As it reached its peak, I could see trees toppling over. A small Kia got pushed off balance and swerved off the road. As the sound died down, the road devolved into chaos. Some were desperately changing lanes, others were stepping on the brakes. I got my door scraped as the car behind me sped past. The radio was playing an automated message, a local emergency alert, referred to as a geological event. We were asked to turn off all air conditioning, slow down, and divert to the nearest exit. It repeated in a monotone voice. Geological event, no air conditioning, slow down, divert to nearest exit. Minutes passed. There was a line forming further down the road. Police officers blocking the lanes in all directions, leaving a highway exit as the only option. Some folks were trying to push past the barricades, but were forced back at gunpoint. I could see officers wearing gas masks and riot shields. We were waved in. I followed the exit and got directed to the right. There was an open field that was used as a sort of impromptu parking lot. Cars were being waved in and parked in a way that boxed us in, leaving no room for us to open our doors in either direction, unless we got parked at the edge. 4 lines of cars with about 15 vehicles per line. Surplus vehicles were directed further down the road. The place was packed. I got stuck in the second row, about 6 cars in. Pretty much everyone around me were on their phones. I didn't have anyone to call, but there seemed to be an issue getting a signal through. The radio was still repeating the emergency message. Voices were getting louder. A man 2 cars to my left leaned out of a gap in the door, screaming at the officers to answer his question. They responded immediately with a warning shot, straight into the air. "Stay in your vehicle," they screamed. "Lock your doors. I'm not telling you again." A couple of folks were filming, but there seemed to be trouble uploading. We were losing bandwidth. It didn't take long until phone signals were completely blocked. I think a video or 2 of that officer firing into the air made it online. They were patrolling back and forth. We were told to stay in our vehicles, windows up, doors closed and locked, engines off. I could hear people talking in the other cars. Someone said there'd been a natural gas leak from the geological event, and that combustible engines could spark an explosion. Others were talking about a terrorist attack. There were no answers, and the officers weren't eager to talk. After about an hour, things were getting ugly. People were hungry, thirsty, and restless. One officer stepped up on the front cars, handing out water bottles, crackers, and processed cheese slices. He had to step from one car to another, denting the hoods with his steel-tipped shoes. They were also handing out thick black plastic hygiene bags for people who needed to relieve themselves. Use them, seal them, drop them out the door, then lock up and wait. I crawled into the back seat, pulled down my cap, and tried to relax. I'd been playing some games on my phone, but the battery was running low. I wanted to save some, so I settled for having a nap instead. The sweat was stinging my eyes, not because of how warm it was, but because of how nervous I was. No matter what I did, I felt trapped, and the car felt smaller and smaller. I couldn't get out if I wanted to, and it physically hurt me to think about how little control I had. Is that what claustrophobia feels like? A couple of officers were discussing something by the front line. One of them had a white cotton glove on, which he used to wipe off the hood of one of the front cars. The glove was taken off and put into a bag, which in turn was sealed with a hot air gun. I was getting the impression that our cars had been covered in something. I wasn't the only one considering it. There were 2 college college kids in the car to my left, and they were discussing it too. Anthrax, one of them said. Gotta be. Nah, gold dust, the other chuckled. They don't want to share. You know what? The first groaned. I honest to God hope you're right. You're not, but I hope you are. Fuck you. I joined in the conversation shortly after. I offered another explanation, something combustible, something that might blow up if we started our cars. They were willing to consider this. The car behind me couldn't hear us, but the driver held up a notebook with the text. If we don't know what it's gotta be aliens. I couldn't tell if they were serious, but they weren't laughing about it. A man in his 50s, and what looked like his daughter. There were a couple of other folks in the other cars. A man in a black shirt, sort of looked like a preacher without a collar. 2 middle-aged women with a kid in the back seat. A fat man blaring Johnny Cash from his stereo. A couple with a teenage son who couldn't stop drumming on the windows. We'd been stuck for about 2, maybe 2.5 hours, when a truck rolled in. One of those with a large water tank. It was unmarked, looked civilian. As it rolled in, they were calling out on the megaphone. We'll be hosing your vehicles down, they said. Keep everything locked and closed. Then we'll be covering your vehicle with protective plastic while we wait for it to dry. After that, we'll start letting you go in an orderly manner. I repeat. Most of us were relieved. It was only a matter of time now. It was getting dark. They were getting up on the cars, hosing them down thoroughly. It smelled of chlorine, so maybe they'd mixed something into the water. As they came to my car, they stepped up on it and double-checked the sunroof, making sure it was locked and secured. They sprayed the car down, bathing it in chemical stink, the kind that gets stuck to the back of your throat. It took a long time for them to finish, at least an hour or 2. After that, they were rolling out a kind of plastic cover at the short side of the lot, the kind you use to protect pools or rain covers for football fields. They used 2 squad cars to slowly drape the thing over the entire lot, securing the edges with large rocks. Please stay calm, they called out as the plastic crawled over us. I know this is uncomfortable, but this is for your own safety. Once the cleaning is done, you will be free to go. Stay inside your vehicle at all times, I repeat. I did as I was told. I stayed inside and I watched that plastic cover sweep over me. It felt like getting buried alive. All lights went out, leaving me in complete darkness, accompanied only by the vague, disembodied voices of the others. The college kids were talking about where they were going to go after this. Someone was honking, not sure if it was to show support or discontent. Someone else was cheering. I took my last swig of water, washing down my final plane cracker. I got back in the driver's seat. I could hear as they finished moving the plastic cover and parking their squad vehicles. I waited patiently, figuring it'd be maybe another hour or so. They hadn't really given us a timeline, but I could breathe a little easier. Sort of. I was going back and forth between feeling empowered with my hands on the wheel and feeling like I was stuck in a metal coffin. It was so dark and everything smelled of plastic and chemicals, like a car wash stuck in time. As the excitement died down, I paid more attention to the background sounds. I tried to filter out the various discussions from the nearby cars, and somewhere in the distance, I heard raised voices. It wasn't coming from the cars, but the officers. Whatever they were talking about, it was a heated discussion. An hour came and went, and people were getting impatient. More cars were honking, others were yelling, demanding answers. I couldn't get my leg to stop shaking. The more I thought about getting out of there, the smaller the car felt. I was hyper-focusing on things I couldn't control. I was a little thirsty, and I was out of water. I needed to use the bathroom. I wanted to stretch my legs and go for a walk. I wanted to breathe fresh air and get that awful chemical taste out of my mouth. starting, accelerating. The truck was moving, somewhere off to the side. "We need you to stay in your vehicle," a voice screamed over the megaphone. "Do not leave for any reason. Stay in your vehicle." Cars speeding off. Not many, but a couple. Then, quiet. The officers left us there. Everyone was quiet. A couple of folks had opened up their phones, using them as flashlights to look from car to car. Looking out at the sea of vehicles, all of us trapped under that dark cover, I could see a handful of lights cut off by sharp silhouettes. I couldn't make out who was who in the dark. It was all just people. Anonymous. I heard a gasp somewhere in the back. There was a metallic clunk, like when the officers climbed atop our cars to get us our water. There was a careful cheer, as some folks figured they were taking off the plastic cover. But that wasn't it. Instead, there were more footsteps. The cheers slowly died down as more and more footsteps pattered across our cars. I stopped counting after a dozen. The silhouettes in the other cars were still. We all held our breaths, waiting for an answer to show itself. What the hell was going on? What was that sound? Somewhere off to my right I heard a voice. "Who's up there?" It sounded like an older man. I'd seen a pickup truck that way earlier. Almost as a response, the footsteps stopped. There was a faint clicking sound, like someone snapping their tongue against the roof of their mouth. Click, click, and from further away, a click in response. From somewhere to my left, another couple clicks. Then, a cascade of clicks. Dozens, maybe hundreds. There was an awful metallic noise coming from my right. Then, breaking glass. A scream cut short, followed by several irregular taps of the car horn. One of the silhouettes in the distance turned into a blur as something passed through the windshield, cutting through the plastic cover. Somewhere in the front row, the roof of a car was cut wide open. Someone was pulled up out of their seat. 2 cars back from where I was, there was more glass breaking. It sounded like a wild animal got in. I could see a weak hint of red spattered against the passenger side windows. I wasn't getting any air. I could feel my heart beating through my chest as my arms started shaking. My hands were cramped around the steering wheel, and I felt sweat dripping down my shoulders. I couldn't control it. I didn't even see what was going on, but these sounds, these screams, they awakened something primal. This was danger, a threat. My body knew long before I did. The college kids in the other car were ducking down. One of them waved a hand at me, as if telling me to get down. I nodded. I scrambled into the back seat. I couldn't see where I was putting my hands or my feet. Everything is different in the dark. As I tumbled my way over, my foot accidentally tapped the car horn. It was a quick tap, a fraction of a second, but to me, it was the loudest sound in the world. I was lying on my stomach in the back seat, and within seconds, something heavy climbed onto the hood of my car. I could feel the car buckling. It was much heavier than the man who'd passed out water bottles. I held my hands in front of my mouth to stop the panting, but I just ended up snorting up sweat instead. My nose stung as I bit my tongue, listening to every metallic groan as whatever was outside moved and shifted. Click, click, and from behind my car, a click in response. There were no lights being held up anymore. Everyone was cowering, going quiet. I pushed myself up against the door behind the driver's seat, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear the frame of the car complain as something slowly moved. When it came to my sunroof, there was a slight crack. That made it stop. Another crack. I silently shook my head, as if trying to ask the car to stop. That thing was going to break. And it did. My legs were showered with glass as a big blob of plastic cover dipped into my car. Something big came tumbling into the front seat, still covered in protective plastic. It twitched and spun around, its clicking turning from a careful question-like noise to a never-ending barrage. It was calling for help, alerting others, and it was cutting its way through the plastic. There were footsteps coming from every direction, some of them leaping from car to car, some of them leaping far enough to skip a car as they hurried. I was going to be swarmed within seconds. I fumbled with my hands, accidentally cutting my thumb on the broken glass. I managed to open the passenger side door, but even at its widest, and even when pressing into the college kid's car, it wasn't enough room to get out. Still, I had to try. I pressed myself into the gap and exhaled as much as I could, flattening my chest. While the thing thrashed around inside my car, I could feel my vision going faint. Black spots popped up at the edge of my vision. My arms were going weak, and yet, by some miracle, I made it through. As my face hit the gravel of the makeshift parking lot, I felt the burn of residual chemicals. I swallowed my instinct to run, instead staying on my stomach, forcing myself to crawl under my car. There were more of them, some climbing on, some off. My chest was pressed to the ground as the weight shifted. I heard breaking glass from the windshield and tearing fabric. Something was stuck up there, and it was furious, like a trapped animal. I could hear the college kids mumbling to one another, trying to stay calm. One assuring the other that all they had to do was stay low, stay quiet, and wait. Then, something slammed into the passenger side door, the one I'd crawled out of. The door was pressed up against the neighbouring car, then fell haphazardly to the ground, completely off the hinges. An ink-black bird-like foot touched the ground right next to me. I've looked it up since. There were 3 toes forward, 1 toe backward, all clawed. Anisotactile feet, similar to that of many birds of prey, except larger than a human foot, and with smooth, oil-slick skin. It must have been heavy, at least 400 pounds. If the clicking noise came from its mouth, I can approximate that it was somewhere around 6'7" to 6'9", or taller. It could have been hunched over. How it managed to walk in the gap between the vehicles is beyond me, but I suspect it was very thin. It daintily walked from my car to the others, as if scanning for something. I could barely see anything in the dark, but this thing seemed to navigate it perfectly. It didn't bump into anything. There was a tap on the glass of the car behind me, to my right, and someone got startled. A short scream, and the hunt was on. This time was different. It must have caused some kind of chain reaction, as all of a sudden the plastic cover was getting torn up left and right. People were clawing their way out of their cars. I heard someone kicking against their windshield. Another was trying to open their door. I could hear it slamming against the side of the car next to them. And off in the distance, there was gunfire. Just a couple of shots. The college kids in the car next to me slammed their doors open and followed my lead. They rolled onto the ground and under their car. There was a little more light coming in as the cover had been torn above. Their faces were red from tears, and one of them was desperately trying to call for help on his phone. The other grabbed the phone out of his hand. A short scuffle ensued, ending with them putting on a ringtone and sliding the thing as far to the left as they could. Whatever car that phone landed under was demolished. Every window broken, every passenger gone. I could hear the grinding as a seat was ripped in two and thrown away. In a matter of seconds, an entire vehicle was torn to pieces as a dozen of those things swarmed it. "Shut up!" one of the college kids repeated. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." Something reached under my car. It scraped against the sole of my shoe, tearing a hole all the way to my big toe. I hurried forward, scurrying like a lizard. The college kids noticed and followed suit. I don't think they thought about it too much. It was just movement, and they went for it. I made it 2 cars down before I got stuck. There was something dark in the way, and I couldn't get around it without exposing myself. I couldn't see what it was, but it didn't take long for me to figure it out. There was a meaty crunch, as if someone was biting chunks out a piece of meat. It was struggling to get through the fabric of their clothes, making a snapping noise as threads gave way. A pool of blood rolled under the car, staining the tip of my fingers. It was still warm. One of those things were eating a victim. I hunkered down, trying to remember to breathe, and I stayed there, waiting for a chance. Any chance. I must have stayed there for at least an hour, hearing every bite, every crack of bone and snap of sinew, satisfied clicking noises. As it finished its meal, it wandered off, dragging the remains along. They were moving forward. Something heavy walked over the car I was hiding under, dragging a body along. Slowly, the footsteps disappeared. It was quiet again, and in that quiet, I found my footing. I made my way to the edge of the plastic cover. I listened one final time, pushed one of the weights away, and slipped through. They were gone, and I was out. I could feel my chest growing lighter, allowing me to breathe. I wanted to cry from relief. A breeze was picking up, drying the sweat on my brow and carrying the smell of grass. Stepping back, I turned towards the sea of cars to see how bad the damage was. And then I saw one. It was a bit off to the side, perching on top of an old Honda. At a glance it looked like a tall person, covered in a slick black ink. But looking closer you could see the strange bird-like feet, the pointed nails, the long row of shark-like teeth on a mouth that was far too wide. I froze. The thing rose to its full length, easily over 7 feet tall. It looked ready to pounce on me. I had nothing to defend myself with. I couldn't make any sudden moves. I wouldn't even be halfway under the car before that thing would be over me. 100 thoughts raced through my mind, but there was nothing I could do. I was out of options, but the thing just looked at me. It raised a slice of raw meat. Blood dripped on the plastic cover. It looked at me curiously, taking a bite. Then, as if nothing had happened, it wandered off, satiated. I was left there, shaking like a dry leaf, and with the last of those things gone, all that was left was the panic. It didn't take long for the officers to return. The plastic cover was removed, but we couldn't go home. Not after this. Some folks signed a waiver and were let go immediately. They weren't allowed to talk about what they'd seen, and in return they'd get a hefty sum of insurance money. Others demanded answers and were taken into custody for obstruction of justice. A few others still were too panicked to make any kind of sense and had to be checked out by medical personnel. A total of 14 people died. It was described by a combination of causes: a traffic pile-up, carbon monoxide poisoning, animal attack. I think there was something about an escaped convict too. Excuses all over the place, and the times were all wrong, spread out through a couple of days to more smoothly blend into accident statistics. And if you wanted to go home and get your insurance money, you had to sign a non-disclosure. I did too. I know the college kids did as well. Goddamn miracle they made it out, but I saw them. 34 cars had to be towed, 18 people wounded, 6 seriously so. 4 people lost at least 1 limb. One guy had an arm ripped off, halfway up his collarbone. I don't know how he survived. Most people never saw those things up close. They just remember the screams and the breaking glass. Sometimes, at night, that's all I hear too. Closing my eyes reminds me of lying under those cars, feeling the pressure as the weight shifted. I still get trouble breathing. I think a part of me is still stuck there. It stayed in my vehicle. He loves this cemetery. There are all kinds of smells for him to investigate. I love it because it's paved and an easy walk. Moose trotted over to me, and looked up expectantly, wanting a quick scratch behind the ears before continuing down the path. I knelt down and rubbed ears before planting a kiss on his nose. Just then, a deep roll of thunder sounded overhead. I glanced up and noticed a storm was coming in fast. I snapped Moose's leash onto his collar and picked up the pace a little. It was just after 6 o'clock, but the dark storm clouds made it seem almost night. I wish I'd checked the radar before we left the house. We finished up our walk quickly, heading down to the large iron entrance gate. As we rounded the corner, the gates looked to be closed. Weird, I thought. They don't usually lock up until after nightfall. The groundskeeper must have wanted to beat the storm home. We walked up to the gates, and my heart sank as I realised there was a large padlock across the front. Great, I thought. We just got locked inside a cemetery. I glanced around and didn't see any other gates. This was the only entrance into the property that I knew of. I dropped Moose's leash and dug my phone out of my backpack. You think this is considered a 911 type of emergency? I asked Moose aloud. Just then, a large bolt of lightning streaked across the sky. I guess it is when you're about to get hit by lightning, I said again aloud, and punched 911 into my phone. A dispatcher picked up almost immediately. 911, what's your emergency? A voice said. Hi, I started, suddenly feeling nervous. I'm so sorry. This probably isn't exactly a 911 emergency. I was walking my dog in the cemetery, but apparently they locked up early tonight. We are locked inside. Okay, Mum. We'll get someone out there to unlock it for you. Which cemetery are you in? He asked me. I'm at the one that Avenue J dead ends into, I told the dispatcher. Hold on. One moment, ma'am, the dispatcher replied. I could hear him clicking away at a keyboard. You said Avenue J. There is no open cemetery on that end of town, ma'am. No, I walk here almost every night. It's that... I looked up to read the large metal letters protruding from the top of the gate. Oak Hill Cemetery. The sign is on the gate. Oak Hill Cemetery. I could hear him murmur. Oak Hill Cemetery is not open to the public, ma'am. I don't know how you would have gotten inside there. What is your name, please? I didn't have time to process what the dispatcher was telling me. The lightning was sprawling across the sky, and Moose was starting to get nervous. It's Allison Land, and I'm positive I am in Oak Hill Cemetery. I am looking at the sign right now. Another crack of lightning burst across the sky. My heart raced. The storm is about to hit. It's lighting really badly. I am in the Oak Hill Cemetery, I repeated. Okay, Allison, you're positive you're in Oak Ridge right now. The Oak Hill Cemetery is not open to the public. Also, it's not storming outside, he said. What is going on right now? Did I dial the wrong number? Is this a prank? I asked, pulling the phone away from my ear to check that I actually dialed 911. Moose was cowering from the thunder in between my legs. I led us underneath a tree right as the rain started. It just started pouring down rain. Can you please get me out of here? I asked, starting to get worried. Okay, Allison, we are going to figure out what's going on. You said it's storming right now. What time did you leave to go on your walk? I left at 5:15. It's only a 2-minute walk from my house. I live right down the street on Avenue J. Allison, I need you to listen to me. There is no publicly open cemetery on Avenue J in Oak Ridge. I need to figure out where you actually are so I can get you some help. Can you see out the gate? Do you see any identifying landmarks around? The dispatcher asked me. I don't understand. I started to argue back, but the line clicked. My phone went completely dead. Did I forget to charge it? Did I lose service? This couldn't be happening to me. I ran back to the gate in the pouring rain, reached through the bars, and tugged on the lock. It Moose was still cowering under the tree, whimpering. He hated storms. "Don't worry, Moosey," I called over to him. "We'll get out of here." I remembered that an old cemetery office building was located right around the corner of the path. It was used as a storage shed these days, but maybe a door or window would be unlocked. "Come on, Moose," I called, turning to jog down the path. He followed, hunkering down low, almost crawling after me. The building came into sight just where I remembered it being, nestled against the fence behind several rows of graves. I tried to avoid stepping on any directly as I wound my way through. Moose followed right behind, not bothering to be careful where his paws tread. The building had a large awning over the front door. I stood underneath it and began trying to wring out my clothing a bit. Moose shook his whole body, splattering water and mud all over myself and the front door. Thanks," I muttered. I turned and tried the door. I didn't really think it would be unlocked. It was just a last-ditch effort to get out of the storm. But, to my surprise, the handle twisted and the door budged slightly. I pushed into it. There was something blocking it on the other side, but I eventually managed to push it open, wide enough for us both to slip inside. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dingy light. This room must have been the front office at one point, but was now piled with clutter and old furniture. I spotted a light switch next to the door I had just pushed through, and one of the 4 bulbs was still working in the lamp overhead. It flickered slightly and didn't provide much light, but enough for me to scan the room. There was a desk shoved up in the corner with a really old desktop and a landline sitting amongst other clutter. I made my way across the room to test the phone. I plugged it into the wall and picked up the receiver, sighing with relief when the familiar buzzing sound rang through the headset. I dialed my mum's number. It rang once, then went silent. I tried my dad next with the same results. I hesitated then, but decided to give 911 a try again. A dispatcher picked up on the second ring. 911, what is your emergency? A familiar voice answered. "Oh, hi, my name is Alison Land. I believe I spoke with you a few minutes ago about being stuck at Oak Hill Cemetery," I responded. The dispatcher replied, "Oh yes, Alison, I'm glad you called back. It looks like the connection was lost on your end a few moments ago, and I wasn't able to reach you on that number again. Hang on one moment, I'm going to call my chief back into the room. He helped me look into the cemetery when I lost you earlier." I heard a muffled, "Hey chief, she's back on the line," from the dispatcher. Moments later, a man's gruff voice was on the line. "Hello, Alison. My name is Chief Brooks. I hear you're stuck inside Oak Hill Cemetery," he asked. He did not sound pleased. Maybe I shouldn't have called 911 for this after all. Yes, sir, I am. I walk my dog here every night because of the paved pathways. I guess it was locked up early because of the storm. The thing is, there is no longer an Oak Hill Cemetery in Oak Ridge. That cemetery was closed permanently almost 50 years ago, in 1977. I didn't respond. What he said was not sinking in. That was impossible. I came here every single night and walked moose. I have come in and out of the gates hundreds of times. I looked around again and started to have a sinking feeling. The furniture was dated. I knew the office had been closed for a while, but this furniture looked like it was made in the 70s. The phone I had in my hand was boxy and yellowed. The computer next to it was also large and boxy. I picked up a piece of paper from a large stack on the desk that was dated September 8th, 1977. I could hear Chief Brooks speaking, asking if I could still hear him. "Sir," I interrupted. "This is impossible," I whispered. "I know you don't believe me, but I'm standing in "It's coming from the old cemetery," I faintly heard the dispatcher say. "Okay, kid, I don't know how you got inside there. The gates are barred and the fences are too high to jump. Enough playing around. I'm sending an officer out there right now, so I suggest you get out of there before he finds you, or you're coming down to the station." Click. I held the phone up to my ear, not moving. The buzzing of the ended call rang through my whole head, making me dizzy. I dropped the receiver and slowly slid down the wall. Moose, who had been having the time of his life, exploring and sniffing around the room, trotted up to me and licked my hand. I grabbed his face and said, "What is going on, Moosey?" He wriggled free and continued to sniff around. He found a doorway behind a stack of chairs and disappeared through. I stood up and followed him out of the room into a small hallway. There were 2 other doors, both closed. I opened the first that led into a small bathroom. The walls were covered in a dark green tile from floor to ceiling, with a faded orange toilet and sink. There was one of those old-styled fuzzy toilet seat covers on top. I looked out the window and noticed, for the first time, that the neighbourhood that should have butted up to the fence was not there. It was just open, empty land. I rubbed my eyes hard and looked back out the window. Nothing. I was starting to panic. I left the bathroom and opened the second door. It was a small kitchen with a very vintage-looking refrigerator and a few appliances. There was a table and 2 chairs in the centre of the room. I plopped down on one and opened my bag I always carry on our walks. I pulled a couple of treats out for Moose, who had been following me around, and tried my phone again. The screen wouldn't even light up. I dropped it back into the bag and laid my forehead down on the table. This couldn't be happening. Is this some elaborate prank? Did my brother somehow convince a police dispatcher in chief to be in on it? Was I losing my mind and actually not even in Oak Ridge? Or did I somehow transport myself back in time to the 70s? No, I will not accept that I am losing it. I stood back up and looked out the small window over the sink. It was no longer raining, but the sky looked like it could open back up at any moment. I went back to the front room toward the door. I realised that the thing blocking it was an overturned filing cabinet. I pushed it out of the way, opened the door all the way, and slid the cabinet back in front of it so I wouldn't get locked out. Moose also saw it was no longer raining, so he followed me out the door and resumed his usual exploring around the area. I walked back around the corner to the gate, still locked. The metal bars were almost big enough to slip through, but I was nervous I would get stuck. They were also rusted, and I didn't want to accidentally cut myself. I looked out the gate and all around the surrounding area. The houses looked different. Still, the same houses that I walk past every day to get here, but they looked newer. The paint was fresher, and the driveways weren't cracked. I remember this neighbourhood was built in 1975 and felt my heart sink again. I suddenly remembered that my grandmother, who died in 2002, was buried up the hill in this very cemetery. I started running up the hill, calling for Moose to follow. I weaved through headstones to the spot she was buried, but I almost choked when I got there. It was empty. The little plot that my mum's entire family would be buried in was completely empty. Even my great-grandmother, who passed before I was born in 1989, was not there. It was an empty plot of land with one small marker at the top centre printed Burgess, my mother's maiden name. I sat down in the wet grass and started crying. This made no sense. How is this even happening? After what felt like ages of sitting in the wet grass, mulling over what I could possibly have done to get in this situation, I heard the loud, squeaking sound of the gate being opened. Moose was already taking off down the hill. I followed closely behind and saw an older model truck parked right outside the gate. The style was old, but it was shiny and new. A younger man, probably in his early 30s, was pushing open the gates. I started waving my arms, barreling down the hill. "Hey!" I called out, "help me!" I startled him, and he dropped the heavy padlock that was on the gates. I flew past him out the gates, skidding to a stop right past his truck. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. When I stood up and turned back around to ask if he knew what was going on, he and his truck were both gone. The gates were closed again, secured with a large, rusted lock. Moose trotted up next to me, looking at where the man should have been standing. He started whimpering, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. I looked up and saw that there were no clouds overhead, but the sun was beginning to set. I pulled my phone out of my bag, and the screen lit up instantly. 5 missed calls from Mum, 3 from Dad, and about a dozen angry, "Where are you?" texts from them both. It was 8:30 in the evening. I was trapped inside that cemetery for over 2 hours. I dropped my phone back into my bag and stared, bewildered, at the gate. Right as I was about to start my walk home, a police car with its lights on came around the corner. I froze in place, remembering what the chief had threatened over the phone. "Alison Land?" the officer asked, rolling down his window. "Yes," I croaked out. The officer stepped out of the car and opened his back door. "Chief Brooks is waiting for you down at the station," he said, beckoning for me to get in the car. I looked at his open door and back to the gate again. "How do you even get in there?" he asked me as I climbed into the back seat, Moose following right behind. "And why are you so muddy?" he asked again, fishing a towel out of his trunk. I didn't answer. I was absolutely speechless. No one was going to believe this.